wanted to thank you for being here again tonight. We've got close to a half a dozen folks again on the line from the staff of the Carnicom Institute. And tonight we're going to have the second part of what is intended to be a three-part series covering in a media format a paper that is in development. The paper is fairly far along at this point, but it remains in progress. This paper is entitled Morgellons, a Working Hypothesis, with a subtitle of Neurothyroid Liver Oxygen Protein and Iron Disruption. And the paper will have three parts to it. This is being recorded on a screen share also, so hopefully tonight you will be able to see certain parts of the paper as I wade through it. The paper has three parts to it, and the first part, and I won't repeat everything that was covered in the first webinar on this. I may cover some of it in a very quick summary form, but not to the level of detail at all. Paper has three parts. The first is that the first part of the paper will cover the identification of certain functional groups. We talked about functional groups last time and their significance and what they mean, and how we acquire them with a certain instrument, namely called an infrared spectrophotometer, that the Institute has owned for about the past 6 months now. I guess it's a used one. It's fairly old, made in 1983, but is at least quite serviceable. There is a lot of modernization that can take place with that type of instrumentation, but we do have a functioning instrument that's giving us a very important information coming in. So the first part of the paper covers the use and identification, use of the instrument and identification of these functional groups, which are organic combinations of molecules. It's for living things. This whole project is about something that would be organic, something that would be alive. Kate brought up the question last time about what are we doing with respect to basically metals and what would be inorganic substances, and I told her essentially that doesn't apply with this technology. This technology is directed solely to the existence of organic materials, those of living things, namely involving carbon and hydrogen-based compounds. The second part of the paper is going to cover the potential health impacts that would occur, or likely occur, might occur, could occur, or will occur from the existence of these particular functional groups within a living being. And it would be faulty to think that because you have a functional group, that a functional group is somehow sort of expressive of a disease condition. Functional groups comprise all of organic chemistry, that which is healthy and successful as well as that which might be diseased. So there's nothing to throw this off in one direction and to assume that just because it exists that somehow it has a negative connotation. That's not necessarily true. It depends in what form it exists, and we'll try to look at some of those possibilities. And then the third part of the paper is to present what will be called potential mitigating strategies that are based solely from a research point of view. I'm not a medical doctor. That's very clearly stated on any of the papers. I never assume that role in any fashion whatsoever. In fact, far from it. What I do is act as a researcher and provide information, and that will be done also from the standpoint of what might be potential mitigating factors. We have finished the first section, that regarding identification, last session, the last first webinar, and tonight we're covering the second part on the health impacts of these functional groups. So I just won't take the time to repeat all that we went through, other than if somebody has a question that you think would be beneficial to make sure we didn't miss anything, please don't hesitate to do so. Last week we described the intent of the paper, and then we presented the general spectrum, which is on the screen now. There may be a delay on the screen, and then we went through the functional groups and got to the point where This is the list that has been tallied up as a result of my research as being the most probable list of functional groups. And what we're going to do tonight to start things is I will go to the point, it would be right at the end of what I'm calling phase 1, and the paper is broken up into those 3 categories. You'll see a phase 1, you'll see a phase 2, and a phase 3. The paper is quite involved, there's no way around. It's about 80 pages now, and it's been 6 months in the making with 3 months of instrument work before I could do that. So we've got a total of probably 9 months invested in this paper. In part, that's because I'm only available part-time to work on this, but nevertheless, it is quite involved in terms of the work that's going on here. I've already made my caveats in terms of I'm not a spectrometrist by trade. That's a whole career in itself, but I have applied myself with what I would call diligence to the problem and study of the situation, and feel as though we have a pretty strong basis to work from here. Now, where I'm at on this paper now, which looks like it's about a little bit over a third down the paper, something like that, not quite halfway down under its current state, is a place where the paper at the end of the phase 1 work listed the functional groups that this work identifies, again to the best of my ability. I won't go through that whole process again, but basically it involves existence of absorption peaks within the spectrum, looking at correlations or repeat locations of absorption. You're looking for patterns. You're cross-correlating those. You're looking into tables that list these absorption peaks within the spectrum and what functional groups are associated with them. And there's a whole analytical process that I went through to come up with this list. And those that can see the screen will see that I have close to about 10 items there. It's arbitrary in terms of where the cutoff is on this. I have a list which can include some other items, most definitely, but I cut it off about 2/3 of the way down the list just to include those that would appear to be most likely, most probably identified here. I'll read that list very quickly. Right now that list is that of amines and carboxylic acids and aromatic substituted alkenes, aromatic substituted amines, alkanes, aldehydes, aromatic phenols, and alkyl halides. Now, we all understand that nobody's expected to understand what all these mean at this point. I can't say that I know everything. I have tried to educate myself as best I can in time and effort I put forth here. But we would understand that not everybody would know what these mean yet. But what we hopefully do understand is that these represent combinations of organic molecules that are at the core of biological existence. It has been learned over time that as complicated as we might be as biological beings, that the biochemistry of what takes place, that the focus of it is on these functional groups. That's why there is so much interest in them. Most of the reactions that take place from a biochemical point of view are taking place within what are called functional groups. There's no set finite number of how many there are. If you go to look for a table of them, you'll find one book that'll list, say, call it a dozen of them, saying these are the primary functional groups. You'll find another book with a more detailed listing that might have 24, this type of thing. But either way, what they're doing is reducing the potential combinations that can occur down to a manageable number, call it a dozen to 24, that are known to have significance in terms of biochemical reactions. So if you want to call it 24 or something like that, you're seeing that I'm listing roughly 8. That the 8 of that set have been identified by my work as being what I call target groups. I'll always use the word candidate or target or potential just because it's the way life is until you have supportive or corroborating work and this type of thing. And just because we have to acknowledge that there are many unknowns. But this is the list that existed by the time I finished this. Now the next part of that paper, right before we went to phase 2, was I tried to give a little bit more meaning. I won't have time to go through them all, but I tried to make a visual section of the paper available to try to give you some sense as to what these functional groups mean visually. And they're only sort of clues, but you will find a table that follows this list that will give you some type of visual impression about what these functional groups are most likely to represent. I'll go through a couple of them just to give you an idea, and we'll scan through the paper, and maybe those listening can be looking at the paper themselves on the website to take your time through this list. Now, in addition to the functional groups, we must also remember that this work is going to combine previous work that has also been accomplished, which did not use this instrumentation, which used other methods for identification, largely but not entirely based on a process called chromatography, where you're attempting to separate a solution, in this case a solutions that I had involving the biological filament. By the way, it was never mentioned in the second phase. Those that heard the first one certainly did. But the purpose of this paper is the analysis of a biological filament sample that is, to the best of our knowledge, known to be characteristic of the Morgellons condition. That's the subject of analysis and research here. So there has been earlier work done using different methods of analysis and identification. And like I said, chromatography was a big part of that. In that work, you will find that two major findings developed from that work. One, there are other things, but in terms of components, physical components of that filament structure, two other things were identified. One is the presence of iron, significant, actually would appear to be significant relative amounts of iron, and in particular that iron appears to be in what's called a highly oxidized state, and that has serious implications in terms of health, and we will at least be introducing health topics as we talk tonight, and then there'll be another whole section of the paper as well to follow to discuss it in even more detail. But iron was found, and that's why you see that up at the top of this sort of visual chart is basically metal. And again, these are just graphics to illustrate a point, but iron is extremely significant in relation to the blood, extremely significant with respect to oxygen. Oxygen does not exist in the blood without iron existing. So if one were to find iron in a growth form of a filament, then there is a strong inference immediately that iron is basically likely being utilized, taken from the blood, and being utilized for the growth of the organism. So there'd be serious ramifications to that type of thing. So iron was one of the early components that was identified in this work. And the other one was that, sure, go ahead, please. Well, it has to come from somewhere. What we would understand is that the iron has to come from somewhere, okay? And if it grows within the body, one would, let's say, establish what would be a plausible basis for the use or taking of that iron. And the blood, I'd have to dig into percentages in terms of where it exists, but I think that we'll find that probably. And again, I don't want to, I'm not a medical doctor, so we can always check on anything that I'm saying. But I think that we're going to find the blood will be one of the most important sources of iron in the body. Yes, they have, right. This is a growth form. This is something that grows within the body, and that growth form needs to nourish itself. It must provide nourishment for itself, and the body is the most likely source of that nourishment. basically you enter into the question of a parasite. What's the definition of a parasite? And a parasite is basically something that will use the resources of its host for its own sustenance. Maybe someone wants to try and make the case that somehow this nourishment is coming from outside the body, but right now I would have a very hard time understanding such a case, particularly with what's being identified here. Yeah, no, that's fine. Hopefully everyone heard the question, but yes, basically what we're speaking about is resident within the body. It reproduces itself in a rather continuous fashion. It appears over an extended time, and so it needs nourishment. So one has to ask where that nourishment comes from. So a reasonable assumption that can be made is that the source of that iron comes from the body itself, and one of the most probable sources of that is the blood, as well as another reason one would suggest the blood is because the blood has been directly observed to be seriously impacted in a negative way structurally. Basically, the blood cells are falling apart. The walls are being breached under more severe conditions, it appears. So the functioning of the blood itself can be directly observed to be failing. The second type of compound or structure that was previously identified through other work was that of amino acids. Specifically, 2 amino acids appear to have been identified. We'll find as we go along that we don't want to restrict it to that, but 2 of them appear to be identified, and that included cysteine and histidine. Now, again, just to always keep ourselves on ground level, because technical terms can tend to lose us, and I don't ever want that to happen, because we must always understand what it is we're speaking about before we get too involved in the details. And we must ask, what are amino acids, right? And amino acids are the basis of proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. And there's roughly 20, whatever it is, close to 20 amino acids that are the basis of living creatures. And some are called essential and non-essential, but basically they're all part of the body, and they are the basis of proteins, and proteins make up roughly, from what I can gather, looks like about 50% plus of your body. I think it was 55 was the number I came up with. But structurally, and in many ways, your body is made of proteins, and it needs these, and so amino acids are at the very core of your existence. So once again, if we find a substance that's within, call it a growth form, that's foreign to the body, and it has in part composition of amino acids, which, by the way, should not be surprising, since 50% or so plus of living forms is in a protein sort of state anyway. So it's not a surprise that you would find it, but the fact that you do find it would be a very important finding, because it's further evidence of something being alive, and it's further evidence of something that is using essential nutrients that would normally be used for the host, in this case, being used by that parasite, if one were to accept it as that. So you'll see that I have the food groups there right next to it, proteins, the bodybuilders, just because that's a way of visualizing their importance. Okay, and now what I'll do is run through the list, because I'll have to get through these a little bit more specifically, because the truth was we're not even in phase 2 of the paper yet, part 2. But these are the parts, and we need to see what these are. We didn't have a chance to go through these last time. And I have to say, I try to get through this as quickly as I can, but when I have 2 to 3 months of work invested in each section of this paper, it's very, I hope, easy to understand why it's hard for me to condense those 2 or 3 months down to a couple of hours of talking. But I'll do my best as I'm able to. So if we start seeing the rest of this list, now you will see there was a reference to cysteine and histidine, 2 specific amino acids. Everything has importance. In the end, everything has properties, everything has purpose, everything has structure. So when we have the time to talk about that, all of these things have that. And so it's not just an amino acid, it's an amino acid that has certain characteristics and qualities and importance. And we would talk about those. By the way, histidine is a structural form that's actually part of hemoglobin. Cysteine is a form of amino acid that's one of the things that it's known for is having very, very strong bonds, very difficult to break because it has a tendency to form what are called disulfide bonds. But everything will have these characteristics, and those characteristics will be important to understand at some point. The next one listed there would be aromatic substituted alkenes. Now, let's start breaking these down a little bit. The term aromatic is going to be extremely important in our discussions as we go along. You know, and if I don't make this in one time, then we'll just do it again until we do make it, whatever it is, because we have to understand certain things. And aromatics are going to be absolutely crucial to understanding where we're going in this discussion, because aromatic chemistry is an extremely important branch of biochemistry. There are two sort of main divisions that can be made. You can always categorize things in many ways, but one of the ways that organic chemistry and biochemistry has been separated is by what they'll call aliphatic compounds and aromatic compounds. And aliphatic, which is sort of regular and general organic chemistry, will be chains of things. Like when you've heard the word polymers and this type of thing, and you have chains like carbon and hydrogen, and they go on in these chains, and then things branch off of these chains. That's what they'll call aliphatic organic chemistry. And then there's going to be this other branch called aromatics, and this is a major division in chemistry. Now, ultimately, it's not that it has to be either or, you know, one or the other. It can be both. You can have aliphatics attached to aromatics. In fact, depending on how complex it is, sometimes you'll get to that point without any question. But the fact that something is aromatic or the fact that something is aliphatic would be a very important division to make, because aromatic chemistry has a whole lot of very important properties to it that we will get into. So to break this down a little bit more, what this phrase was saying was you had an aromatic. Anytime you're seeing that ring, it would be what's called a benzene ring. Six carbon structure there. That's aromatic. And then when you see that thing branching off of it to the side, those black things will be carbons in there, and that would be what they'll call an alkene. Alkene will be double bonds between carbons. You'll see those two lines going between those two black guys, and that's a double bond between two carbons, and you'll see that that's attached to that aromatic ring. So that is a combination, basically, of aliphatic and aromatic chemistry. We're going to talk about the importance of this benzene ring in probably much more detail as we go along too, because we need to. The next picture is that what you call an aromatic substitute amine, and so you see the same kind of thing. You see something branching off of that amine. off of that aromatic structure. This time it's called an amine. Now, briefly, what kind of significance can be given to an amine? Amine is something that makes up an amino acid, for one thing, amongst other things. And so you can already start to see that ultimately, if you had amines, you're likely to be dealing, a good chance you're going to be dealing with proteins. But you have this interesting situation. You have this interesting situation of an aromatic being attached to it. I will try to explain the significance of an aromatic compound more as we go along. Let's go down to some of the others. I'll have to get through these a little bit quicker. Aldehyde, I'm going to let it sit for itself right now. I just won't have to have time to go through all of these in detail. But the structures are all being shown here. At the beginning, these will be all Greek to everyone, but I'm hoping over time that we will start to take an interest in examining these structures and what they mean. That's certainly my purpose. They do have significance. They mean something. Remember, somebody has taken the trouble to sort of simplify all of organic chemistry for us into these functional groups. So they've already helped us a great deal, even though it might seem foreign to us, and they've given something for us to work with, rather than just having a big pile that we don't know what to do with. Phenol groups, once again, you'll see that aromatic term showing up. Aromatic is coming up very, very strong in the work, and this is very significant. We're going to talk about phenols, but phenols will have, potentially phenols will have some neurotransmitter significance as we go along. They're also acidic in nature. Okay, halogens are showing up as being a likely candidate here. It's one that's called alkyl halides. This will mean a halogen attached, in this case to another, being aliphatic form also. But halides. Halogens have incredible significance here. We have so much to talk about. I'll try to get there. Then you see amines next on the list. We've already talked about those and what their general significance is. Alkanes would actually be, you call it standard fare. Alkanes are basically general chemistry, general biochemistry, carbon and hydrogen. Actually nothing particularly dramatic about them, but extremely important that they are that chaining mechanism that I'm talking about. This would allow compound or structure to extend itself to be able to hook up with something else. If you can start to envision this world of biochemistry where you have these connections of these things that happen, and so you have to get from one point to another. So you can't just say have an aromatic ring just standing by itself and nothing happens. If it's more complex than that, it needs to grow. And how do you do that? You can do that by extending chains out to provide a place for something else to join in. And alkane would be very standard chaining structure of biochemistry. In other words, you would expect it to find it in almost anything, is what it amounts to. Anything that's alive in any kind of way. And then on the last one, you'll see where I, on that earlier work, tried to say, well, it looks to me like, this is before the spectrometry work, looks to me like we'd have iron and amino acid complex joining together. And so there was an initial model that I developed, just a model, that's all it is. It's just a model to say these things are here, how would they join up? How might it possibly look? And you'll see that model was an attempt to incorporate those disulfide bonds. Two things that model did. It tried to incorporate what are called disulfide bonds that I made mention to. Disulfide bonds are very likely to be present here because of the difficulty of breaking apart these filaments. The bonds appear to be very strong, and that's characteristic of disulfide bonds. So that was a part of that model. Another part of the model would be that if you looked at that earlier work, it found what was called a dipeptide. A dipeptide is about the simplest structure of amino acids you could have. It's basically two amino acids joined together. But that's what the work found. So this is what this is as a model to try and formulate a dipeptide with disulfide bonds involving both of those amino acids. By the way, aspartame is a dipeptide, and that's what I used as a reference for comparison to learn that indeed it was a dipeptide. Dipeptide just means two peptides, and two peptides would basically mean two amino acids joined together. Now I know that took a little while, but what we see now is that we are at the beginning actually of this phase 2, where the title of it is Potential Health Impacts of the Various Functional Groups and Components. Let's see if we want to read. I'm going to go ahead and read you a couple of sentences because this lays the groundwork for what this next 20 or 30 pages is about. Let's read a little bit of it. We now have a puzzle before all of us. We are likely to have some of the pieces that make up the whole, but we must all work on putting the pieces together. Infrared spectrometry alone cannot do this. Additional resources, execution, and smart thought will be required. The earlier this puzzle is solved in detail, the better we will all be for it. I can only ask you to join in the crusade. Until that necessary level of understanding is achieved, I will continue to offer my own interpretations below. The discussion will progress through generalized structural interpretations, possible and projected health impacts, and the review of various strategies that may be worthwhile of consideration for mitigation of the anticipated and observed effects of the condition. It will again be emphasized and expressed that no medical advice or diagnosis is to be given here. Each individual must pursue the counsel and advice of their own chosen health practitioner. The information provided here serves research purposes only. So this is where it's going. I will read the next one because that's what we're going to do. It says, the next sensible need is to tabulate the reported health impacts and symptoms alongside the functional groups, so that we may begin the process of comparison, correlation, and analysis between them. The lists are not necessarily exhaustive or complete or without error, but they should provide a useful beginning to the problems to be solved. So this becomes the basis for the analysis that takes place. And Kate and I were speaking just the other night of an understanding of how the work is actually occurring in parallel. We have two parallel lines of analysis that are taking place, and it's important to not always try to put them sequentially, because they don't exist sequentially. These are two parallel lines of reasoning and analysis that take place, and then we're going to try to merge them together by the time we get done. But the two lines of reasoning on this paper will be to the left and to the right, and let's look at what those lines of reasoning are. On the left side, we will have a line of reasoning of saying these are, or what are, however you want to call it, these are the reported, I use the word reported, observed, or research-based candidate health impacts or symptoms of the Morgellons condition. In other words, based upon the best information that we have available, this would be a combination of my research, it would be a combination of the Institute project, on the Morgellons research project that is in process of gathering information from other sources. What's the best list that we can compile? Now, there's nothing to say it's perfect, but it is a reasonable list that has been developed to the best of our knowledge that encompasses the health impacts or symptoms or something that is directly observed through research that is impacting the health of the individual and is claimed by those affected individuals to be characteristic or representative as a symptom of this particular condition, Morgellons condition. There, I gave enough qualifiers to let you know that it's not perfect, but it's a reasonable list based upon the knowledge available. Not a bad idea to probably read through this list, because this is one of the lines of reasoning that must always be kept in the forefront as something that I need to be processing, something I need to be thinking about as I'm working through this problem. Let's go through them so we see what the list is. The list reads, skin lesions, non or slow healing. Second, skin-borne filament production, skin manifestation at the more developed levels. I'll have some subtitles there sometimes, and this one says the skin is an excretory organ. Next, chronic decreased body temperature. Next, oxygen deprivation, diminished oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Next, immune system breakdown. Some of these are huge in terms of their overall significance. That's a loaded phrase. Metabolic disruption, indications of thyroid and adrenal complications. Significant oral filament production, the presence of filament structures within oral samples. And one could also say iron there if you wanted to. Unusual or extreme dental issues, tooth decay or loss. Chronic itching, stinging, crawling, or biting sensations of the skin. Dark particles emerging from skin or scalp. Hair alterations, i.e. texture, thickness, loss of hair. Neurological impairment, i.e. blurred vision or floaters in the eyes, slurred speech, ringing of the ears, tinnitus, loss of coordination, loss of strength, extended or chronic fatigue, cognitive impairment, i.e. mental confusion, inability to concentrate, short-term memory loss, brain fog, in quotes, unquotes, gastrointestinal imbalance, joint pain, specific blood abnormalities, an increased level of acidity in the body, the impact of increased oxidation, greater free radical presence, and their damaging effects upon the body, liver toxicity, gallbladder and bile duct complications, respiratory problems, including proclivities towards a chronic cough or walking pneumonia-like symptoms, the presence of a bacterial-like component, chlamydia-like, within or surrounding the red blood cells. Recent research indicates that the urinary tract may be equally affected with the presence of filament structures. And this last comment there, the smoking population may exhibit an increased incidence of the condition due to additional oxygen inhibition within the blood. And then it says this list derives from two sources, analytical and research work from this site and from the Morgellons research project. So combination of sources, again, nothing intended to be necessarily perfect, but it's a reasonable, I think, portrayal of that which is known. And the list is also not just listing something because it might be. It's a list which has evolved through reported, observed, or research-based work. On the right side, and this is now another parallel line of reasoning that's going to take place, is simply what are these functional groups that appear to be identified in this spectral work. And so I won't repeat them all, but this is a list that we just went through. And there will be, 10 groups, 10 to 12 groups, or whatever they are. Okay? And so these two things sit side by side at this point. They just exist. On one side, you have a set of symptoms and health impacts that are reported in association with a particular condition. On the right side, you have a set of specific functional groups or organic combinations that derive from the direct analysis of a biological filament sample, an oral biological filament sample that appears to be truly and characteristically representative of the Morgellons condition. Now, people can debate this as to what they think is representative or not. This is based upon the research that this organization has been involved in for several years. There is no recanting of any type that is taking place. The work still supports these claims, and as a matter of fact, the claims would only be further supported more strongly as time goes on, but that work will have to unfold further in the future. So this is the two things side by side. What I'll do is I'll mention sort of the tactic or the strategy that will be taken, and it's one at a time. It's very, very involved and tedious work, but I'll go through what the tactic is without actually going through it in each case. Okay, if you have such and such a thing, be it iron or whatever it is, if you had this, what are the health impacts that are associated with that? Okay. That's what's going to be done. It's not saying bad or good. It's just saying what are if you had a particular functional group, what are the likely health impacts that might occur in association with that? If you find iron, what might that mean in terms of its impact in the body if iron is either disturbed, impacted, disrupted, taken away, added, either way? That's the approach that will happen. And you'll see this start to happen for every one of those functional groups.
Kate, a conference participant, asks, considering the significance of iron to the blood, what happens when it's deprived of iron, and how exactly is the iron consumed? Where does it go?
If iron is taken away from the blood, then there'll be questions, well, where does it go, right? Now, we might presume that, yes, it goes in to support the growth of this organism, but what if other things happen that we don't know about? What if the iron were to somehow increase in the body in a free form? And if it did, then what oxidation state might it be in? So, it's not necessarily so simple as a one-way street. It's a matter of a process involving health that might be impacted, and how might that impact something else. So to me, it wouldn't be so straightforward as automatically assuming it's a reduction or a diminishment of some kind. But I think that's certainly up on the very front of the list to consider, and I think that's what the table will try to list. But I think and obviously I'm saying in this paper, if we look at it over and over, I'm saying there is a major obligation and responsibility of the health communities to be stepping forward here in a very direct way to be supporting the questioning and research that's taking place here. What I can do in my work is, at the very least, is at least raise some questions about what I think needs to be examined and what investigations need to take place. I can't begin to act as a party that necessarily has a resolution to these images, but I can certainly raise them. And this would certainly encompass terms such as basically theft, disruption, increases, right? Out of control reactions that might be taking place, diversion, right? All of these things should become prominent in any health professional's consideration, I would think, of nutrients and body systems that are being affected. So I hope that helps, but I don't view it as, this is not a simple one thing affair where I have all the answers, but I certainly as heck will be raising questions. Okay. Are there any other questions from anyone else on the line before we go on? Please ask if you do have any. It's a good time to do so. And some of the people are on mute, so I'll give them a second to unmute their phone if they wanted to say something. Okay, I'm not hearing any other questions at this time. And if that's the case, then having given you the strategy that will be taken, let's start to step through it. And I'll take this one as iron as an example because it's a really loaded issue. This iron is huge in terms of its potential impact upon the body. And this one was even a little bit more involved maybe than some of the others will be. But let's start stepping through these. Now, I'm not sure if I'll get through them or not, but ideally this would be the goal of the second phase of this project, included within this webinar. I'm just not sure if I'll make it, but if we understand where we're going, what we would have is a functional group or a component on the left side. We're saying, okay, this is what we're looking at. And on the right side, we'd have health impacts potentially resulting from the existence of that functional group and or some combination of it. And that was an extremely important qualifier that I added there at the end. And then visualize that process taking place through all of these, so you have an idea that even if we don't make it through, I'm hoping you'll have a picture of where we end up. And the picture is you're going through each one, call it 10, whatever it is, you're going through each one, and you're going through the same process on every one, and you're not caring at this point whether or not you have a redundant health effect. In other words, a particular health impact might show up in more than one of these functional group, right, correlations. That's fine. You just let it go. You just list any and all health impacts that are associated with each one. We'll take care of the redundancy issue or an overlap later on. Now, let's go through that. I do want to go back to this iron one because it'll give you an idea of how important one of these things can be. It's 1 out of the 10, call it. And this, if you read this, what's happening here is, before I even get started, I'm actually just calling on a previous paper that I have written, of which, by the way, I think is worth our time, if you have the time, to please use those previous papers, because there was a great deal of work, which actually sets the basis and ties in with this paper that's ongoing now. And some of that work, we could say, will be repeated, because I'm not sure it's ever been read the first time, is what it amounts to, because this iron issue was actually stated probably a couple of years ago, and the significance remains then, if not more so now. But as an example of just one item, what I did here, before I could even get to the table form, I just listed, I basically researched and asked, what are the things that we know about iron? How might it affect things? What do we just know about it? And I'll go through some of them. I don't think I can go through all of them because there's 16 of them there, okay, before I even get to the table. But let's pick up some of them, okay? It'll say something like iron is in a certain oxidized state, and that'll be important to us, is a core component of the filaments. Primary source for iron in the body is the blood. A primary nutrient source for the Morgellons growth form is the same iron. Iron in this highly oxidized state can no longer bind to the oxygen in hemoglobin. For iron to bind to oxygen in the blood, it must be in a certain oxidized state. That one is one loaded statement, folks, if you want to understand what our bodies depend upon. Our entire processing of energy in our body is dependent upon oxygen, the entire process. And if that is interfered with in any way, you've got a major problem before you even got started. Oxidizers produce free radicals. Free radicals are highly reactive molecules that wreak havoc within the living system. And by the way, this is not intended to be negative. This is just intended to be, listen, this is just the way it is, the way it appears to be. We'll deal with the negativity And positive aspect says we understand what's happening. But this is not about raising despair or fear amongst people. It's about educating ourselves about that which is likely impacting our existence. So there's one. Iron in the oxidized state is likely to bind to several toxic respiratory inhibitors, such as carbon monoxide. Oxygen deficiency is a serious issue. Oxidation requires energy. Where's the energy going? Where's it coming from? Bacteria is a strong relationship between bacterial forms and iron. You'll see me state that very clearly. But any bacterial infection in the body requires iron to live. All right, let's go with that and oxidation. Iron, all right, summary statement. Iron is a key element in the metabolism of almost all living organisms. So that was just a list from a previous paper. Then I discussed about how this iron needs to be in a certain state for oxygen to be attached to it in blood. If it's not in that state, it won't work. The blood will not work. So you can't go messing around with the oxidation state of that iron and expect your blood to work. Now, we then get to the table. Now, what the table does is it'll put the item on the left side. In this case, iron. You'll see it on the left side. It'll say iron in the highly oxidized state, right? Then the process will be to look at the list of symptoms that we've already talked about that are reported to be in association with the Morgellons condition and ask which of those symptoms or impacts upon health have, based upon either research or direct observation, have some association in some way with iron. Again, using the words of disruption, interference, possible taking of it, possible increase of it, but some kind of disruption or interruption in that component or functional group occurring within the body. How does that connect? Might it connect with the list of symptoms? And so what's happening on the right side of the column is no longer a generalized statement. It's something that is taken specifically from the list of symptoms that have already been reported. And this is what's important. This is a matching process that is starting to take place at the early stage. And all of these that show on the list should be there based upon some type of research or investigation of association or correlation that I have made. And I think if you will read the paper in detail above it, you will find the basis for that inclusion expressed, at least by far in the majority, if not to the detail across the board. And if not, you will find references that will list impacts of the health that somehow provided a basis for picking that, what you'd call a subset. It would be a subset of the entire list, that it was appropriate and relevant to associate it with the existence of iron or an interruption of it. Okay? So there's an example of the first one out of 12. And specifically, examples are there that if I had an iron problem occurring in the blood, I might expect, again, based upon direct research and observation, there's nothing being sort of just created out of thin air here, of things such as extended or chronic fatigue, okay, gastrointestinal imbalance, immune system breakdown, oxidation, lower energy levels, bacterial forms, blood abnormalities, metabolic disruption, liver toxicity, bile duct, increased level of acidity. Okay, those are examples. So you can see that there's already, even at this early stage, just making it through one of the 12, that there is at least a degree of correspondence already taking place between the health impacts as they are reported or observed and the basically documented research that shows the existence or likely existence, if you want to qualify yourself, of a particular component or functional group. You are already seeing an associative process take place that is worthy in its own right, I could stop the paper right here, and I would say it is worthy of significant in investigation and study on this one issue alone, on the level of cross correlation that is taking place on the iron issue alone. And that is why that iron issue was stressed so much in some of those earlier papers, because it is a profound finding. It is of major impact if indeed the iron in the body is disrupted.
Kate asks, wouldn't lab tests on an individual show a connection from both directions of your equation, from observable symptoms on one hand to health issues caused by the presence of given functional groups?
Well, yeah, that's what can I do here but act as basically a spur to that which I know needs to be done, right? And all of us. And how is that done, right? That's, in my life, it's done by forcing the issue when you know something needs attention. And that's the obvious issue that's being forced here. If you have any sense of compassion for people that are suffering and ill, and if you happen to be fortunate enough to have a body of research that might lead you in a certain direction to be going, and you feel it's worth taking advantage of, and by heaven's sake, do it, right? And by do it, I mean get the processes and systems in place that will alleviate the suffering and find the answers. It would certainly be my hope that the professional communities will at least avail themselves of the information that's being made available to them, and to evaluate its merit, and then to apply it if they deem it relevant. Right? That's certainly my hope, and it's certainly a major purpose of this nonprofit organization is to promote this research and cooperation and participation by those affected and those that care. Okay, so I think if I'm trying to use a half hour as a guide here, what we would do then is go through each of the groups, not to great detail, but enough to see that it's happening for each one, and to see that there are significant impacts that are being recorded here with the existence of these groups or compounds. Now, I also think that we need to take some cases of understanding sort of how that was. All right, well, look, there's one. That was straight research based. If I'm looking at this one, see, it'll be a combination of all sources, whether it's me researching, whatever it is. But the next case is that of amino acids. Now, what I did here before, I didn't even have to go very far on this one, because the topic here was that if a person was deficient in amino acids, in other words, it's a reasonable hypothesis to make that if some growth form shows the existence of amino acids, that it's not unreasonable to think that they're coming from the body itself that's supporting the growth. So it's not unreasonable to think that you might have an amino acid deficiency within that individual. Not unreasonable at all. Okay? Whether that's the case or not, we get to prove amongst ourselves as we see fit. But this raises that question that if you did have an amino acid deficiency, what might be the impact of that? Now, in this case, it was very straightforward, because this is taken from a reference. I found another chart, and this is from our Dr. Guy Wilson. We'd have to look at the reference there. Let's see, that's right about and a half. We can look at the references, but this would be 34. And this is an amino acid chart by a Dr. Guy Wilson. So this is what he did, right? He listed what were the problems associated with amino acids. Now, in my case, I'm then using his chart to match up with our chart of reported symptoms and asking, are any of them the same? And this is the list. And once again, you will have a major overlap taking place with consideration of amino acid deficiency alone. And all I did here was use an existing reference that we can all look up on, and we should be finding all of these things in one way or another on this doctor's list. Examples here are extended or chronic fatigue. I mean, think about it. Proteins, right? The source of structural building in your body, the formation of tissue, the creation, basically, of biological matter. This is what we're talking about when we're speaking about amino acids. It's one thing to fix something that's wrong, but you've got to be able to grow, first off, to repair damaged tissue and this type of thing. So what's his list here? Extended or chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal imbalance, skin lesions. Interesting, right, that you see things involving skin with consideration of that alone. Chronic decreased body temperature, oxygen deprivation, immune system breakdown, start to see overlaps. Metabolic disruption, hair alterations, neurological impairment, cognitive impairment, joint pain, oxidation, free radicals, liver toxicity, lower energy levels. I don't know about, I can't speak for others, but it starts to become of interest to me right away when I start to see overlaps on things, because I'm a person that's always looking for patterns. And I haven't even really hardly started, and I'm already starting to see significant overlap with the original list, as well as even overlaps even between individual topics. Okay, we go on. Yes, please, somebody is asking a question, and please speak up real loud if you can, so we try to make sure it's heard. Please, no, that's okay, Dan. Let's go ahead with it. No. Yeah, great, thanks for asking. It's an important question. The issue is being raised here from a general standpoint. On one side you have a body of research that says it appears to be rather strongly corroborated here that there is the presence of amino acids within these filament structures, the oral biological filament structures, that amino acids are existing, right? That's the first part. The second part, what we're doing right now, is just saying, if you did have a disturbance or a deficiency, some kind of interruption in the body of that particular system or component, in this case, amino acids. Now, we're not talking about the filament at this point. We're simply saying that in the body, if you were to have an amino acid deficiency, and I already sort of went through the chain of logic there, that it's not, to me, unreasonable to postulate that if we have to ask, where did those amino acids come from to support growth in the biological filament, right? Where did they come from? There's a logical case that can be made that they came from the human body itself. So this is the flow of logic that exists, and it says that if, therefore, you accept that you have an amino acid deficiency, everybody can decide on that, whether they think it's true or not, but it's saying if you do, if you accept that, what would be the impact from a health standpoint? And that's the right side of the chart. Okay? So at this point, we're not saying I'm talking about the amino acid in the filament. I'm simply saying that the supposition is that this system appears that it's disrupted. If it is disrupted, what might be expected to happen? And going through each one of those systems or functional groups in this case. Does that help, or does that make sense, Dan? Okay, thank you, and I hope everybody picked up the question. But I think Dan was trying to distinguish what are we exactly saying we're looking. Where are we saying there's an amino acid deficiency? And I answered him with what I regard as sort of a line of logic that leads to the generalized supposition: what if there is a deficiency? What might be expected? And that's the process being used for all of these at this point. And so the next one is histidine deficiency. This is a specific amino acid that, again, I always qualify myself all the time because I'm always looking for corroboration or refutation. It's okay either way, but I have to seek the truth the best that I can. The work that I do says there's the presence of histidine. It's a very specific amino acid. It's very interesting in terms of its connections with blood, but this is very specific. It says with this specific amino acid, what might you expect? And you start seeing things like joint pain and blood abnormalities and immune system and gastrointestinal imbalance. So a shorter list, a more specific candidate. Okay, next one going on for cysteine. What might happen if you had a cysteine deficiency? Again, another specific amino acid that appears to have been identified. That in earlier work. Remember the earlier work, not done through spectrophotometry, involve chemical methods largely based on chromatography, but not entirely. There were lots of methods used: electrolysis, chromatography, visual light spectrometry, ninhydrin protein tests. There were a lot of different methods used. And that's a separate body of work that precedes this that ended up with the conclusions of the presence of iron, significant amounts of iron actually, and these two amino acids, and at the very least what certainly appears to be a dipeptide form, which by definition is composed of two amino acids. That's what the definition of a dipeptide is. And whether or not it is going to be these specific amino acids, time will tell, but it is certainly what I came up with. Okay, going on, and all right, so here's a statement. Here's a statement arising at the stage where the truth is I'm still considering primarily the earlier work that's been done, but now I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, all right, now let's start to investigate these health impacts, likely health impacts, and to start to put that together in a form where we can sort of cross-correlate it. And then I made a statement at the end of this. This is getting us only through the iron, only through the amino acid stage of the work. And it says, it becomes increasingly obvious, even at this early stage of presentation of identified constituents and functional groups, that the disturbances of the iron and amino acid balances within the body are at the very heart and essence of the symptoms and health impacts of the Morgellons condition. My position would be that there is sufficient information at this time to fully warrant proper investigation of all of the health impacts that are recorded above this line in association with tests or whatever you want to call it that would look for and detect any disturbances in the iron and amino acid systems of the body. That a sufficient case exists for that, even at this stage of the paper. So we get to all apply our pressure in our various ways to try and force that situation to come about. But the paper continues, and now we start going through each functional group. And functional groups are a little bit different because this is where you have a specific molecular structure that's taking place. It's really a fascinating world, folks, that we have instrumentation that can show us things that we couldn't even begin to see with our eye, and to appreciate the decades of work that has been done before us to develop these sciences. It's really an amazing thing that we have an insight into this type of information with the availability of this instrumentation. And it's a very fundamental physical principle, and that is that matter responds to energy. If you pump energy into something, it reacts. And in this particular case, it reacts in a way that can be identified literally, structurally, from a chemical standpoint. And the learning about the structure of something and what it means is a fascinating process that is very fulfilling for those that are willing to engage in it for the purpose of understanding what we're talking about. This is not a simple journey. It's not easy. It's been slow for me in terms of it takes an investment of time and energy. I can't give this stuff to you in a nutshell. I'll try to give you some of it. I have written about it. I won't have time to talk about it in detail, but I have tried to write and communicate to you what I've learned, and even what I write is only a summary of that which I've been through in my studies. But the very first one, for example, here is looking at the case of an aromatic. And what does it mean to have an aromatic in a structure? And yeah, sure. Right. Yes. Okay. Um, yes. Okay. Now, an amino acid is actually not a functional group by itself. It's more complex. It's more developed than a functional group. What is a functional group that applies to what you're speaking of and is relevant is what's called an amine. An amine, and we'll see that later as we go along. An amine is a functional group. These things are all defined. They're very specific. Amino acid is more complex, so it's above that of a functional group. And the reason the separation took place and does take place is that process of the earlier work involving what you'd call more classical methods of separation. Imagine before they had IR machines, right? Before they had these, they did what they could. And most of the work done in chemistry was done through what you call, it's qualitative work, and it's all kinds of separation techniques. And they involved, preparing solutions and reagents and glass columns and all kinds of things that were discovered over really hundreds of years, as you look into the history of chemistry. And that's how things were done before you had an IR technology available to you. So this is what I had to do before I had this machine. And when you're doing that kind of work, you find whatever you can in whatever way you can do it. But you'll never see. Well, no, that's not really true. There are some methods even to detect functional groups chemically, but it's not the norm. You do whatever you can do that's in your brain power and your resources to identify. In my case, I was able to go for the existence of iron, and I was able to go for the existence of amino acids. These are not functional groups. These are, chemical combinations or states. Iron is an element, right? So it's as basic as it can get. Absolutely correct, Kate. Absolutely correct. It had no association. The amino acid and the iron work had no association with IR work. By the way, though, the iron did have a great deal of association with what you call visual light spectrometry. Okay, we have another instrument that measures visual light, how it affects matter, and the detection of iron in it was a very significant part of it. So all I'm saying is that the IR work was not associated with that, but there were probably a half a dozen methods that were used. Now I have access to a different kind of information through the use of a particular type of technology, IR, that shows us things we could never have seen in any other way. And so it's like a process of discovery. And the very first one on that list in this case is what I call an aromatic structure. And if you remember at the beginning there, we talked tonight, I had a list of about 8 to 10, whatever they were, and that list evolved through a whole process that we talked about on the first meeting. So I have to just assume, okay, we have this list, let's start running through it. And that's where this is starting. And look at that, there's the first sentence. It's sort of great that she asked that, because look how, this is how I tried to make the transition. There's a little horizontal line there, and it starts out with this. It is now time to begin the examination of the functional groups from the same perspective, i.e. the comparison of the expected effects from a functional group with the actual reported health impacts of the Morgellons condition. So that was the lead-in, and then I start saying, well, here's the first one we can start talking about, and this one is an aromatic. Now, I don't know how far to go with this, because that alone, it's just a process of discovery. What is an aromatic, and what does that mean? And this is where I learned about this major sort of division in chemistry between this whole thing of chains. So normal standard chemistry is chains of things. Carbon and hydrogen, just go on, they can go on forever. Carbon and hydrogen doing all this stuff, versus something looping around on itself, which is what distinguishes this thing. Here is where the carbons loop themselves around and joined on to the tail end, and to ask what this really means. And to me, the history is fascinating on stuff. It's how you sort of get context. And it's rather fascinating. This is a little bit of a tangent for us tonight, but the fellow that discovered this thing is Faraday, Michael Faraday. Now, Faraday, if people know about him, he was the electromagnetic guy. He was the guy that, he was a guy without credentials that did all this work in electromagnetics that basically set the whole stage for Maxwell coming up with the electromagnetic equations, okay, the 4 equations. that completely described, to at least in conventional science, electromagnetic theory. Faraday was a very great guy, and he was a seat of the pants investigator, and he did so much work, and he didn't have anything fancy in his life either. And he's the guy that discovered benzene, and he was out on the streets, whatever it was, London or somewhere over there in Europe, and he sees this oil dripping down from the gas lamps, this clear solution. He starts asking what it is, and in that process he discovered this compound called benzene, and it basically changed chemistry. It was a huge advance in the knowledge of chemistry because it was so different than anything that was expected. Properties of it were that it was very stable. It was incredibly stable, and nobody could understand why it was so stable. It didn't make sense. So there was a whole new branch of chemistry introduced, and benzene is sort of the textbook example of what aromatic chemistry starts with. And so that's how I start with this paper, and I say, if we have an aromatic, what does that mean? So you start looking at benzene. It doesn't mean it is benzene, but it is the basis of aromatic chemistry. So you start looking at that, and you'll see where I start, and I say, what are the properties of this? And you'll see, well, yes, it's toxic. It's bad news. They used to use this stuff in labs, and they found out it's bad news, and it's been knocked out. But, look at what it says, right? Benzene by itself is toxic, leads to bone marrow depression, and lowered white blood cell count. Now, people need to be careful when they read this stuff, and they need to do some homework. And they can't just say, Carnicom Institute says there's benzene, and benzene's toxic, and it leads to, white blood cell count decrease. It's not the way it works. Organic chemistry is fascinating in that the slightest change in the structure of something can completely change the properties of what's happening. That's true. By the same token, it is still, nevertheless, always very valuable to always go back to the basics, to understand what those core structures are about, what are the properties of them, and do understand that. And then, when you have that knowledge, then you can start to ask the question, okay, what if it was to be tweaked in such and such a way? And, what's the source of that tweak? Is that likely? And this is, the professional chemist, and they can understand how things are going to interact. So I have to start by presenting that basic information. It's part of my educational process too. And then we will go on to where we will consider some of those variations that take place. But benzene chemistry, I've spent many nights just studying basically aromatic and benzene chemistry. And it's been quite a revelation because it leads you down certain doors and pathways that become extremely important. I'm going to try to get to at least one or two of them tonight. I'd never be able to get to all of them. But benzene is a fascinating opening that took place in chemistry when Faraday discovered it, because it didn't fit. It didn't fit what people expected to happen. And because it didn't fit what they expected to happen, they had to learn how to explain what did happen. And in doing so, they learned about the structure and what it meant, in terms of chemistry. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of how it became so important then in their process of discovery, and how it becomes equally important and relevant to us today. It's at the very heart of the things that we now need to be looking for. Here's a wonderful example of the importance of understanding benzene. When you have a benzene ring, by itself, we'll probably spend a few minutes on this and then I'll try and go on, but it's just an incredible saga to me of what we've gone through here. When you have a benzene ring, by itself, it's sort of especially stable. This is what really surprised everybody. And intuitively, that might not seem like such a stretch because it's this ring structure, right? So it's looped around. But normally they expected it to react with things, and it didn't. And they were trying to figure this out. And they learned that, well, some things reacted with it. It wasn't necessarily what they expected, but some things would cause it to react. And one of the major things that they learned that started to react with these aromatics were halogens. Now, halogens is going to be another amazing sort of discovery process for us. in terms of their importance. And we'll need to cover them both at some point. But halogens are things like fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. They are the most reactive chemical elements known. They don't exist in a free state in nature because they are so reactive. Okay? Now let's try to get back to what happened here. They discovered that these halogens would start to react with these benzene rings. Now, but then the key sort of component that became important was what caused that to happen. And they learned that there were certain things that caused this reaction to happen, and that they acted as catalysts. Now, the role of catalysts has become increasingly important in my understanding, because they're absolutely amazing. Catalysts are where you have these things in nature. They could sit side by side a million years, and essentially nothing ever happens. They just sit there. But then you bring this thing in to the picture, and it's not even directly involved in what happens. It doesn't even change form. It just gets in there. It gets in the system. And all of a sudden, those two things you were talking about have this major important reaction that take place with them. And everything changes. You have this reaction take place that never would have happened. And enzymes in our body are the classic case of a catalyst. And we have all kinds of reactions that take place in our body only because these enzymes are there. And they would never happen otherwise. So hint, hint, if that process gets disturbed in any way, then the reactions don't happen. So here's what happened in benzene and halogens. Guess what? There's two of them. Oh man, I got to find the table for you. Let's hope I can find it. I hope I can find it. There's a place where I have a red chart, a red line. I know one of them in my head. The other one is not in my head, but I'll try and get it. But I'll give you one real soon. There it is. Wonderful, 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 wonderful. Okay, hopefully it'll show up on the screen share. But I'm hoping that you'll see this red and blue line and this little chart. And I'm going to go ahead and break and ask, just does anybody see that so that I know the screen share is still working? And I'm going to wait it out for a second. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. They found, get this, folks. They found that if you had an amine group, we've started talking about amines a little bit. Amines are the building block of an amino acid, like Kate was asking about. They found that if you had an amine, this certain like combination of things, guess what? It's called a functional group. Guess what? It's one of those that has been identified in this particular work. That if you had an amine attached to a benzene ring, that a halogen could very easily attach to it. That the amine acted as a catalyst for something that would never happen otherwise. You'd never have it happen. But if you had that amine attached to that benzene ring, then a halogen could very easily attach to it. Now, if you start to see a picture that's emerging here. Now, we haven't talked about halogens yet and what they mean. But your clue will be the thyroid is coming up, folks. But the picture that's already starting to emerge is the work says there's an aromatic here. In fact, it says it quite strongly. The work says that there's an amine here. In fact, it says it quite strongly. The work also said by itself, without me even having this knowledge of the catalytic process, the work also says that it looks like we have halogens present. So there is a body of work, even in this early study of now just starting to talk about the functional groups, of having one of the most important types of reactions, one of the most standard reactions, that it's textbook chemistry with aromatic chemistry to study what they call the halogenation of an aromatic ring, the process being a catalyst, in particular amine, as well as what's called a hydroxyl. You'll see them both on that chart on the far end. These guys make things happen.
Kate asks, what is the cause for the presence of or source of halogens in the body?
what Kate is asking is exactly the question I hope that everyone is starting to ask, because it's the question that you are led to ask. And you will find, let's see where I did it, you're going to find this whole section. So you have to put these things together, but you're going to find this whole section. Ah, yes, here it is, and it's before I even started talking about, because I found evidence of halogens. You'll see, let's see, benzene goes there. Let me find it. Yeah, all right, and there it is, halogens. It might now become enlightening to begin asking the question, what might be sources for halogens in the body? Because I start talking about this reaction. This reaction is likely to take place. Again, it's textbook chemistry. So I say this reaction looks like it could easily take place. So then what I do, I don't quite get where Kate is getting what she's asking for yet, but I get there eventually, because I have to start answering Kate's question by saying, first of all, where would we get halogens from? Okay, where might they come from? And so I have a whole chart here, a whole set of basically environmental sources for halogen. This is not even assuming that it's present within the sample. It's just saying, what if I were to have halogens available? Where might they come from? And what you'll find is that, unfortunately, we have an environment that is loaded with halogens, and they are toxic. The body was made to accept and use iodine. Iodine is a halogen. If you look back in the origin, the whole evolutionary thing, iodine is found in marine organisms in the oceans. And for those that follow the evolutionary theories, there's a direct line of reasoning that leads to human beings in basically living forms. They have learned to assimilate and accommodate and utilize iodine, the one halogen, the only halogen that can be used. And we do need it. As you'll see, it's incredibly important. But this work says that if you start asking the question of, are there environmental sources of the other halogens that are not good for our body? They are toxic. There's no way around it. Chlorine, fluorine, bromine, they are toxic to our body. No good at all. And you ask, are there environmental sources for them? And, other people have been way ahead of the curve than me on this thing. But you get to start looking, what's all the fuss going on about fluoridation in water? Look at this picture I found, folks. This was real, okay? They sell it as baby water. Purified baby water. And guess what it has in it? It has fluoride in it, okay? Fluoride is a halogen. I mean, they're selling it on the store, okay? It's in the toothpaste. You want to ask where halogens came from. This is a whole section. I'll read them quickly to get through them. Bromine in breads, the whole flour thing. It was an eye-opener to me. Your breads look puffy and nice. Guess why they look puffy and nice? It's because of bromine in there. Sodas, cereals, vegetable oils, flours, pastas, disinfectant, pesticides, insecticides, preservatives, fire retardants, pharmaceuticals. So, and there's my line. We can now see that there is no shortage of the halogens within our environment and within many diets. And then, after we say, it looks like there might be a source for them, yes, then you can start asking about the health impacts of them. I'll just say in a simple term that halogens, other than iodine, are outright toxic to the body. Okay, and I'll have these effects in here listed. I'd have to go through them, but they're plain and simple. The body doesn't like these guys, other than iodine. And if we want to find them in the list of the paper, we will. But halogens are bad news, with the exception of iodine. Now, you're going to see the discussion now take another interesting twist, because they do. We already know now that we have a structure that should be of immediate interest to us, in that we appear to have, again, I always couch my language, but the plausible and reasonable and likely existence of the very components that form the core of standard reactions that take place in aromatic chemistry. And this would be the presence of the aromatic ring, the presence of catalysts, specifically amines and hydroxyl groups, and the existence of halogens detected both through the IR approach as well as examination of the environmental source approach. And it's saying all the pieces are in place for something that would be very much known to have detrimental health impact upon the body, but we get to go even a little bit further than that, and we start to now examine the question of iodine and the thyroid. Because I mentioned that our body uses iodine and we need it, and I have on there right now a picture, if it comes up on the screen, of a hormone that is used in our thyroid called thyroxine. And if you start to look at it, you start to see, it's not hopefully all entirely so foreign to you, that you get some sense of this. Because if you look at it, what do you see? You start seeing aromatic rings in this thing, just like we've been talking about. And you start to see iodine attached to it. Okay? And you even see an amine attached to it. They're the very kinds of things that we're talking about. And what you see is you start to see these overlaps between, and I don't want to get too detailed, but it's really interesting. If you look at this, you'll see a picture of tyrosine, which is an amino acid. It's an amino acid that has some of these same type of properties we're talking about. Doesn't have the halogen there. But then you'll see it gets transformed, and it does. Tyrosine is used to make thyroxine, and thyroxine is a hormone for our thyroid. Now, in terms of the thyroid, it's taken me a while to get there. I've had some people that I want to give credit to that have been screaming about the thyroid for years. I've never had the research before to be able to, let's say, participate in the discussion at the level that I needed to. But I sure as heck do now, because I have some information to work with and to see. And what happens is that if you start looking at these, particularly this thyroid hormone, which has iodine on it, but now you make another halogen available, let's say, to it in its presence, particularly something like bromine, guess what? It's one notch up on the reactivity scale. It's more reactive than iodine is. So guess what? It competes with the iodine, and it takes the place of the iodine and messes up this hormone. Now, to get it down to ground level again, and this is where I have come to appreciate the importance of what this whole thyroid issue is about. Because the thyroid, we've heard it, but it has real meaning to me now. Because the thyroid is the basis of metabolism. Imagine you have this master control, okay, that the body doesn't even work. It's like you don't even start running the show until you know that the master engine is doing its job. The master engine of regulating the metabolism of the body. And this master regulator is the thyroid. And if you have anything at all that can mess with that hormone, you've got a very serious problem from the top down on the system, meaning the body. And what I'm saying here is that there is a body of research, again, as everything else that we've led up to before. We haven't even covered the other functional groups, and we're not going to make them tonight. But I'm giving us enough, hopefully, to understand what this paper is after and what it is raising as being very serious questions. And this one just starting at the top level. We could go on and on with these functional groups. We haven't got to the topics of acidity. We haven't got to the topics of oxidation. We haven't got to the topics of neurotransmitters. But this paper, if you take the time to read it, will present a case that it is very conceivable, if not feasible, that major systems of the body are being interfered with or disrupted by the presence of this group and combinations of these functional groups that have been identified. And this thyroid issue is huge. And this issue of understanding aromatics and halogenation and how catalysts become very important in making this whole process happen. Now I'm going to give maybe a couple more examples, and then I'll probably have to start wrapping it up. But I wanted to give another example of the type of thing. Oh, well, look, this was this picture. This was a demonstration of it. This was a demonstration of the problem, of what I was talking about. On the left side of this, I'm showing the original amino acid. There's only 2 amino acids that have this aromatic ring in them. Only 2 out of the 20. And tyrosine is one of them. And tyrosine, to let its importance be known, is going to be involved in 2 very important things. One is that tyrosine is going to be involved in the development of thyroxine, that hormone that regulates the amino acid. Regulates the thyroid. My mistake, okay? Major importance, top-down influence. The second thing that tyrosine is going to be involved in is in something called dopamine. And we're going to be talking about dopamine. I don't know whether it's going to be tonight or another night, whatever, but we're certainly going to be talking about dopamine, because dopamine is at the heart of basically the drive, motivation, and cognitive functioning of an individual. Okay, the neural transmission within the body. So you can understand that tyrosine is incredibly important, and it is intimately tied in with both of these things. And when you start to understand it, you'll understand why it's intimately involved, because if you look at the structure, it fits. And so here's one great example. If you see tyrosine on the left of the screen, it'll show this aromatic ring, and it'll show that amine group. That amine is this NH2. It'll show it being attached off the side. And we'll talk about that OH thing a later time. But you get the general picture that you've got an amine group working off of an aromatic ring there. And then look at the guy on the right side, and here's something where darn if bromine, a halogen, didn't attach to it. Somehow this bromine, this halogen, got attached to this thing, which originally was an amino acid, but now it has halogens. And I can assure you that structure on the right is going to be harmful to human health. We'll find it in there somewhere. But you will find that substance on the right-hand side is directly going to interfere with basically the formation of the thyroid hormone. The iodine is being substituted with another halogen that doesn't work in the body. So it's a great example, and you can start to see this by learning, this, at least in a general sense, this structure. The other one I wanted to mention before I start to close down would be this issue of dopamine. And all I'm doing is I'm throwing out prospects, let's call it prospects of investigation. That's my diplomatic language. There's quite a bit behind it. We haven't talked about the acid one yet, but let's at least introduce this question of, there we go, dopamine. Now, somewhere down on the page down below it, I probably and should have the picture of the amino acid next to it. I mean, really what's best here is to have all 4 of these pictures together. Let me see if I did it quickly, otherwise I'll just have to come back. Those are those 2. It'd be, I'm thinking I may have did it. I have those 2 again. Yeah, I don't have them. Either way, we'll run with it. You'd have to get the other 2 pictures at some point to have this bigger picture. But here's another one for you. Let's start looking at this dopamine and what it might mean. And by the way, why are these things here? These things are here because the IR work says that they're the strongest candidates of existence that I can find. And that aromatic ring, once again, you see it, right? So look what's happening with this dopamine. Dopamine, you have this aromatic ring, and then you have that amine group, that NH2 again, off to the side, right? So that's on there. So now we see that, it has a lot of similarity with what we were talking about before, right? But what do we have here? We have something called OH, hydroxyl group on it. And we see 2 of them. There's 2 of them there. And this particular structure makes up something called dopamine. And what the heck is dopamine? Dopamine, I just put it down in a box beneath it, right? Dopamine, amongst other functions, plays a role in motor control, motivation, cognition, arousal, and reward. Research in the areas of Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, attention deficit disorder, sleep cycles, drug addiction are also very active, to just name a few. we get the picture that this guy is important, and now we're talking about how the brain is working. So this structure exists, it's known, and it has these effects, and we know it. Now, here's what became really interesting to me, and that is, if you, what I call tweak, if you just manipulate that structure just a little bit, and you add on, if you look at this thing, all you do is add on one more of these hydroxyl groups. Same kind of structure, you just add another one at a different part of the ring. And you see that it has 3 hydroxyl groups, which, by the way, we have found, and at least the work shows that they're there. They're called phenols. Phenols are OH groups attached to aromatic rings. My work doesn't tell you how many it has. It just says these are there. Okay, so this is where you must use what I would call a reasoning process. It's not the issue of speculation by itself. It's a reasonable consideration of what might be expected. And what I'm saying here, if you just manipulate this aromatic ring in a very relatively minor way and get another hydroxyl group on that thing, it turns into something called oxydopamine versus dopamine. And guess what oxydopamine is? Oxydopamine is exactly the opposite of dopamine. It interferes in all these processes that we've just been talking about. Okay? It messes with the brain. It messes with neurotransmission. It is actually used, oxydopamine, get this, is used to induce Parkinson's disease. How's that for you? To actually induce it. They use it in laboratory rats to induce the condition. So by one small little shift of the structure of this, we can completely alter how the body is affected by it. And all that we are held accountable for now is to consider reasonable combinations and adjustments that might be expected. And why would they be reasonable? First of all, the chemistry of them. Is there any reason that this chemistry might take place? How big of an adjustment are you talking about? And secondly, a very important one, what are the actual reported symptoms that are coming from this condition? Do they happen to involve, by any stretch of the imagination, cognitive or mental functioning issues? The answer is yes. So you are obligated to consider them by the presence of the information and the research as well as the reported symptoms. And not by exception, but by the rule. And this is where I'm going to need to end. Well, not quite close. I'm getting there. Bear with me a little bit. Let's see. I'll say one more thing about it, and then I'll open it up for questions, and then we'll end. But we understand we didn't make it through the whole list individually, but I went through certainly probably 3 or so top areas of consideration of extreme importance to make the point. Not that the others wouldn't be important. For instance, the example of acidity can lead to the loss of a person's teeth, as well as bone loss, and breakdown basically and mineralization of the body. So nothing here is trivial that we're talking about. But nevertheless, not having time to cover these in any kind of detail tonight, the net effect from phase 2, I'll call phase 2 or part 2 of this paper, which remember its objective was to examine the reported health effects in combination or association with the existence of these functional groups, which are detected by instrumentation and observation. I believe good work has been done here. That was the net goal, right? So the end result of this part of the paper is a combined chart, and this is where the redundancies are to be eliminated. So the final chart of this phase 2 is a compilation of everything together, but now we eliminate redundancies. So the title of it, that you see if the screen will show up, The title of it is called Combined Correlation Table, Functional Groups, Identified Components, Functional Groups / Identified Components versus Likely Expected or Potential Health Impacts. So here, what happens now is you expect all of the functional groups to be listed on one side, and this is what's happening on the left side. All of those are listed. They're not picking one at a time and associating, you're just listing them all, because these were all that were found. And then on the right side, you're listing all of the health impacts that accrued through this entire process of examining each one individually. You're listing all of them, but now you eliminate redundancy. That's what characterizes this chart. And then you look at the whole picture together. And the obvious question that a person would ask is there a reasonable degree of association that can be made between the detection and presence of these various components and or functional groups and the combined list of symptoms or observed health effects in combination with the existence of those groups. Now, everyone gets to make their own judgment as to what they think is or is not. But my assessment, and I'm guessing I probably made a statement at the bottom, so I'll go ahead and read it because that's my conclusion from this chart. That is sort of the grand finale of almost. Actually, I see there's another thing. My goodness, but nevertheless, the grand finale of this charting process. So I'll read this, and then I'll ask for questions, and then I'll pass on one more interesting observation that's relevant to close things down, and then another chance for questions if that's okay with everyone. I'm going to read this last paragraph here at this stage. It says, "It is apparent at this point that the majority of the reported symptoms of the Morgellons condition appear, in part, to be accounted for by the presence of the dominant functional groups that have been described in this report. This confirms the hypothesis that this specific combination of functional groups and identified components remains worthy of additional investigation as to their presence in correlation with expected health impacts. The results also appear to validate the strategies of investigation that have been presented here, i.e. infrared spectrophotometry, functional group identification and analysis, and a study of the expected and potential health impacts from these specific functional groups." In essence, it is saying that it appears as though the research has merit and it is worthwhile both continuing as well as eventually explaining to the highest level in detail, is what that conclusion is saying. And I would hold that that is the case. And it is necessary, and the repeated call for the participation of the health and medical communities in that process, and to assume their rightful role and obligation and responsibility. There is a body of existing research that exists, and this body of work, out of necessity, will involve those same types of techniques that we mentioned earlier that I have used over years of time prior to the existence or an acquisition of this particular infrared instrument, right? So there's a whole body of work based upon, chemical analyses and microscopic analyses and qualitative chemical tests and electrolysis and visual light spectrometry, which we've had for 2 or 3 years now. There is an entire body of work that exists there that makes a very strong case of basically, just as Kate is saying, a level, extremely high level of equality between these environmental filaments of interest that have been studied for many years and the biological filaments. That body of work exists. It's quite strong. And that body of work was sufficient to form the basis of the presentation that I gave in Los Angeles in August of last year in conjunction with John White's project in Los Angeles. And my entire presentation was devoted to that topic. And that presentation is recorded on video. It is available through our site and other places. And I'll mention the title of it because this issue has been going on for years on my side, and I'm far more patient than I'm supposed to be in terms of my sort of level of pronouncement to the public about what the heck is going on here. But I had been doing the work for years, and I finally realized at the time that conference was developing that I had a dozen plus papers, a dozen and a half papers that were saying, here's your left hand, here's your right hand, put them together and let's just see what you see. And I had been seeing it in a gradual way, but I realized at the time of the conference that, even though I've been saying it in rather diplomatic terms, it's time to at least lay it out on the table that, sorry, this is what the left hand is showing and this is what the right hand is showing. And the title of that presentation pretty much says everything that needs to be said in terms of the state of knowledge on this issue at that time. That was August of last year, and that title of that paper was Geoengineering and Bioengineering, the Unmistakable Link. That was the title of that paper, and for good reason. Because a sufficient body of evidence supports that, and even that, a diplomatic term of linkage. But to the degree of information known, that's a fair and accurate statement. So that's just how it was presented. Now, what I can say at this point is that there is a projected body of work that is going to take place, and it is going to involve the inclusion. It is going to involve the inclusion of infrared spectrophotometry in the process. That body of work has been started in its infancy. I'm not at liberty to really discuss it because the work hasn't been developed enough. But I will say that the initial work is completely consistent with the prior findings, and that there will be a body of work, what they would say, God willing, there will be a body of work that will take place that will examine this question to a much more even intense level of detail that, how would you say it? I will say this. An infrared spectrum is essentially a fingerprint. Everything in the world is unique. And when you start to get fingerprints match, as they do in forensic science, there's a time where you have to acknowledge that the left hand and the right hand might be from the same body. But let that work develop as it may. I have a job to do here on this paper first. I'm only 2/3 of the way through this paper. I have just started the last section, which will have to do with mitigating research-based health strategies. Okay, there is a problem here in that there's no reference. There's many problems, okay? One problem is that this instrument is old enough to where it uses an older type of technology that is not nearly as sensitive as new equipment is. So the information you're getting is what you call the more general, lower resolution and will be acquired. And I'll use the word when we acquire a modern IR spec. But it is what we have, and we get valuable information, but at some point we would like higher resolution. That's one. Second is that you have no real reference to choose from. Listen, people have been asking what this is for some time. Nobody's come forth with what it is. I'm doing the best that I can. You have some rather elusive statements that say, well, the FBI was involved in this examination of filaments and they searched their whole system and they couldn't find anything like it. Well, that's fine, but these are hearsay. I don't know of anything published by the FBI on it. But basically this thing has eluded any kind of proper description, and part of that problem is there's no reference at this point. If you don't, if you have the technology and the means, you plug it in and you look for something to compare it to and you get a match, and hopefully you have something. If you don't have a match, then you have something new. The research indicates that very likely we're dealing with something quite new and different here, and this is why it has escaped proper examination. So you don't really have the reference, that's one. You don't have a modern instrument resolution, and you also don't have a database that's immediately accessible to you in the computer world where you can just plug in the numbers and get something. Now I get there manually, I have to do some tricks, but in the modern world this stuff is all plugged in the computer world and databases, and you're matching against databases all the time. I don't have that. There are some tricks I can play where I can do things, but it requires some manual intervention, I guess. Well, there is a database that does exist that is of much interest to us. And if you want a fun project sometime, do what I did and go try to find a database that is publicly accessible, that doesn't cost you anything, that if you were to put in the absorption peaks of a particular spectrum, that it will come back with information for you about what it might be like or similar to, or actually be if you had an exact match. Go ahead and try to find that, and you're going to find it's not going to be very easy to find. There are plenty of databases that are built into modern instrumentation. There are plenty of databases that cost money, but in terms of publicly accessible, quite a challenge and with no cost. And the other difficulty too is particularly if you're trying to find such a database and you think you have found one, find out how complex that database, how that database is able to handle the complexity of multiple absorption peaks versus a single absorption peak. A single absorption peak doesn't buy you anything. You got to have something that handles the whole set where you can put it in there. And I guess I want to say that it's taken some work, but I have found one database that does satisfy this criteria that I'm speaking of. It's publicly accessible, it's free, it's comprehensive, and it comes from Japan. You can't find anything in the United States, but Japan has such a database. It's under the acronym of SDBS. We can find it, Sierra Delta Bravo Sierra. This database does exist and it is accessible. I have used this database. Now, again, there always are variations. It's not plug and play. It's not in Windows, plug and play, right? There's always factors, okay? Factors of databases would be how much error do you have? And you put in a number. How much error do you have in that number? That's something you need to have an idea of. You can't just go sticking in a number without that type of knowledge. Another thing you would have to be able to judge is, what's the sensitivity of my instruments relative to what they're using in this database. So these things are all factors. They just are, let's just say, I've done what I think is reasonable. And I have accessed this database. I have put in the numbers, the actual numbers from my work. Remember that what precedes this was saved till last. It was saved to this stage on purpose, because I had to go through the entire analytical process from the ground up to find out what makes sense under these circumstances and present that case to you and the public. So that was done. Now that that is all done, if I have such a database available, certainly I should avail myself of it. And I've done so. And I put in the information under the best guidelines that I think are reasonable, my error estimates and consideration of my equipment that I'm using, this type of thing. What is rather fascinating is by the time you get done with this whole project, and I literally, at the end, I actually said, this appears to be my best set of numbers that I can use. And this is my best assessment of errors and best understanding of what might be happening with terms of sensitivity to the instrument. Now, it's almost like it's textbook, so I don't expect it to be this perfect and simple in the end. But the fact is, when I put this information in, I did get a return. Okay. Now, when you're after a return here, you do not anticipate or expect that you're after a chemical structure. You're after some kind of compounds, what you're after. And this database, to give you an idea, it has roughly 30,000 organic compounds in it. It's the best in the world that I can find thus far. If you buy a commercial instrument, I've seen they commonly can have a database of about 10,000 compounds in them. So this guy's, no small kid in terms of what it's offering to people. When you get this back, no matter what it is or how many you get back, all that you are realistically looking for is similarity of form. You are not saying, oh, it's this. There's too many things going on. for it to be that simple. The spectrum work doesn't do anything about the iron. Okay, the iron is a huge part of this. That's not organic. It's not part of the picture. Okay, amino acids, as we talked about, are above and beyond amines, and it doesn't pick up that kind of thing. So you'd never expect your return to say, oh, this is it. But what you do want to look at are what type of compounds are coming back from there. If I look at the structure of it, does it have, call it, reasonable similarity to the types of things that we've been talking about in this session? Does it, out of interest, have an aromatic ring in it? Might it have more than one aromatic ring? Okay, these are all. Would it have a halogen? Does it have hydroxyl groups and phenols? Does it have any of these things? Any of them? One of them? I don't know the answer to that before I do it, but I put it in. And the interesting thing is, I can loosen up the standards of what I want. I can get as many. I can loosen up my error estimates. I can get all 30,000 coming back at me. But the interesting thing on this is when I put in my best estimates, all the real numbers, I actually only got a single return. Okay, it doesn't mean there wouldn't be others. I can make as many as I want. But the fact is I got one return back. And that return I got back is shown at the bottom of this section. And you will see the spectrum, and you will see the absorption peaks, and you will see the compound that shows up. And I will tell you that particular compound is absolutely fascinating. Because if you look at this compound, and with some of an understanding of the types of things we talked about, I hope you can see it on the screen, but I'll tell you what I see in the structure, and I'll tell you the name of it, and I'll tell you what the expected impacts of this particular structure would be. Understanding it's not meant to be a catch-all to everything. But guess what you see in this structure? You see an aromatic ring to start with. That's a huge thing by itself. That alone would be of sufficient interest to me. Darn if there isn't a compound that, when matched with the actual data collected from this instrument, which hypothesize that an aromatic ring may be very fundamental to the structure of it, darned if this return doesn't show an aromatic ring being at its core. There's some other things that happen. There are 3 other things that happen. There's 4 things total that happen. In a sense, you could almost say 5 that are happening within the structure that should be perking our interest as saying, there just might be something here that we should be looking at. There might be some associations that are making sense. Here's another one for you. You'll see an amine group attached onto this thing, off to the side. Now, do you remember when we talked about the presence of an amine and how it acts as a catalyst? That its presence allows for the very likely reaction of a halogen attaching to itself by its mere presence. Guess what else shows on this? Halogen. Which one? Bromine in this particular one. Bromine being one notch up from iodine, the next most reactive element. That which would be likely to have a potential competition with iodine. I see these on this structure as I look at it, and you do too if you're seeing it. And there's one other thing that happens here that I see. And all of these have my interest, to say the least. And that is, you'll notice these hydroxyl groups around this ring. And if you recall our discussion, we looked at these hydroxyl groups. They're called phenols. When you have hydroxyl groups attached to an aromatic ring, it's called a phenol. It's a functional group. It is a functional group. We looked at tyrosine, that amino acid, and we looked at, I'm sorry, let's back it up. We looked at dopamine. Remember dopamine? And we were saying that this is the important neurotransmitter, right, responsible for cognitive functioning and all this type of stuff. And we said it has these 2 hydroxyl groups on it. And then we postulated. Again, I wrote about that section of the paper way before I did this, folks. But you see me raising the question back then, what if I were able to get another hydroxyl group added onto there? What might it do? And we talked about that. And we talked about how it would lead to a structure called oxydopamine rather than dopamine. And how that would completely change the picture. And it was basically used as something you call anti-dopamine is another term for it. Okay? Oxydopamine, anti-dopamine is another term for it. It means it's against dopamine. It does all the things that dopamine does in reverse. And you remember the conversation we had about inducing Parkinson's disease? Well, It's relevant, is what I'm trying to say, because if you look at this particular compound that comes back, guess what you see? You see 3 hydroxyl groups exactly in the formation that we're talking about, and now it's time for the name of the compound. And there'll be different names that these compounds can be given, but I'll give you the sort of clue keywords that are in this compound. The actual one name for this compound is hydroxydopamine hydrobromide. Now break this down a little bit. Oxydopamine is what I was talking about, that anti-dopamine. This compound, one of the names was because that's what it is. That structure with these 3 hydroxyls on it, that is characteristic in combination with the amine of what oxydopamine is. In addition, you'll see the word bromide on there. The bromide is referring to the halogen being attached. So what are you seeing here? You're seeing exactly the types of structure and characteristics that basically this paper would predict or project should be there. That's the point. I don't need to say any more at this point about that, other than I hope that we understand its significance. And with that, I'll close down my conversation, at least as within reason tonight, and give you another chance to ask any questions, understanding that the last part of the paper is in process, and I don't know if it'll be, I would project it could easily be a couple more months before I'll finish it. But that part of the paper is in process. Personally, I could terminate the paper at this stage, and I would say that there is sufficient information to get the wheels turning. I'll do as much as I can to lay out on a platter what I know, but there is sufficient information at this point to justify the case of thorough and proper investigation and research and resolution taking place.
Kate asks, would you please restate the process by which you submitted the data to a databank and received the oxydopamine back?
Yeah, I sent the raw data from my Spectrum acquired, Kate, and the raw data here consists of the absorption peaks. Okay, the actual troughs of the graph that we showed. It's submission of those particular absorption peaks, understanding there will be allowances that we don't understand entirely with respect to intensity of them. There'll be errors in the process. And sensitivity of the instrument, but what was submitted was the compilation, the set of absorption peaks in total from the absorption section. This structure that has been basically produced by the database, okay, is the sort of called a check system. It's a counter check on the work. That produces a structure that has certain chemical characteristics to it. Two things then. I guess one to start would be one would examine whether there are similarities in the chemical structure between what is output from the database with input from the Spectrum. One would look for similarities in the chemical sort of signature of this structure in comparison to the types of structures that this paper offers, right? This paper says, it seems to me we ought to be considering this type of structure. We should also be considering this type of structure. We should be considering the combination of these structures. See, that's what the paper is doing, right? In the end result, it's saying we should be thinking about these things being combined together and what they might mean. And you would look at, and there's infinite numbers of those combinations, but you would look in a general sense as to these combinations of aromatic rings, phenols, whatever's in my list, amines, halogens. You would look at combinations of those in comparison to this chemical structure that comes out from this database, and you would ask, is there any kind of reasonable similarity between them? That would be a sensible thing to do. The answer is yes. There's a very high degree of chemical similarity. So that should pique our interest further. And then in terms of its role with the biological filament structure, how would you say it? One would say that it would appear reasonable to think that there might be some degree of similarity or correlation, in part. Remember, I already said that this cannot include everything, can not even begin to include everything, and specifically cannot include inorganic compounds, cannot include compounds that are composed of functional groups, like amino acids. Amino acids are not functional groups. They are more evolved than that. So it can't consider everything. But I'm saying that it's reasonable to ask whether or not there is similarity between what the database kicks out and what the paper projects, number one. And second of all, if there is confirmation, then it even further justifies the case for examination as to whether or not this type of structure or structures similar to it. You really have to think in terms of similarity. These phenols, okay, oxydopamine, amines, bromines, brominated aromatics, these classes of compounds, you would ask whether or not they are now literally a part, indeed a part of that biological filament structure. And you won't get that answer until we get either increased higher level technology or more sophisticated examination of the information that's available to us now. I want to thank you all for your time and presence tonight. I do hope that it has been worth your time and beneficial. I hope that it sets the stage for further discussion and dissemination of this work, and that in particular the health, not restricted to them by any means, but in particular the health and medical communities will at least become aware of this information, if not evaluate it seriously, and consider whether or not it has any relevance in their own research and assistance to the public. So that being said, thanks a whole lot, and we'll close the session for tonight. And in the future, when I get further down the road on the last stage of the paper, we hope and plan to have another discussion concluding this paper with respect to research-based mitigating health strategies. I view all of us in it together, and it happened because of everything we're doing together. And the Institute is what gets credit for that. And the reason the Institute exists is because of the public. And whatever support the public wishes to give to this organization determines what we're able to offer them in return. So it's a combined affair by the time it's all done, and I'll do my part, and it's not happening without everybody spoken of. So thank you as well. To do so. Last week we described the intent of the paper, and then we presented the general spectrum, which is on the screen now. There may be a delay on the screen. And then we went through the functional groups and got to the point where this is the list that has been tallied up as a result of my research as being the most probable list of functional groups. And what we're going to do tonight to start things is I will go to the point. It would be right at the end of what I'm calling phase 1. And the paper is broken up into those 3 categories. You'll see a phase 1, you'll see a phase 2, and a phase 3. The paper is quite involved. There's no way around. It's about 80 pages now. And it's been 6 months in the making with 3 months of instrument work before I could do that. So we've got a total of probably 9 months invested in this paper. In part, that's because I'm only available part-time to work on this, but nevertheless, it is quite involved in terms of the work that's going on here. I've already made my caveats in terms of I'm not a spectrometrist by trade. That's a whole career in itself, but I have applied myself with what I would call diligence to the problem and study of the situation. And feel as though we have a pretty strong basis to work from here. Now, where I'm at on this paper now, which looks like it's about, a little bit over a third down the paper, something like that, not quite halfway down under its current state, is a place where the paper at the end of the phase 1 work listed the functional groups that this work identifies, again to the best of my ability. I won't go through that whole process again, but basically it involves existence of absorption peaks within the spectrum, looking at correlations or repeat locations of absorption. You're looking for patterns. You're cross-correlating those. You're looking into tables that list these absorption peaks within the spectrum and what functional groups are associated with them. And there's a whole analytical process that I went through to come up with this list. And those that can see the screen will see that I have close to about 10 items there. It's arbitrary in terms of where the cutoff is on this. I have a list which can include some other items, and just because we have to acknowledge that there are many unknowns. But this is the list that existed by the time I finished this. Now, the next part of that paper, right before we went to phase 2, was I tried to give a little bit more meaning. I won't have time to go through them all, but I tried to make a visual section of the paper available to try to give you some sense as to what these functional groups mean visually. And they're only sort of clues, but you will find a table that follows this list that will give you some type of visual impression about what these functional groups are most likely to represent. I'll go through a couple of them just to give you an idea, and we'll scan through the paper, and maybe those listening can be looking at the paper themselves on the website to take your time through this list. Now, in addition to the functional groups, we must also remember that this work is going to combine previous work that has also been accomplished, which did not use this instrumentation, which used other methods for identification, largely but not entirely based on a process called chromatography, where you're attempting to separate a solution, in this case a solutions that I had involving the biological filament. By the way, it was never mentioned as second phase. Those that heard the first one certainly did. But the purpose of this paper is the analysis of a biological filament sample that is, to the best of our knowledge, known to be characteristic of the Morgellons condition. That's the subject of analysis and research here. So there has been earlier work done using different methods of analysis and identification. And like I said, chromatography was a big part of that. In that work, you will find that two major findings developed from that work. One, there are other things, but in terms of components, physical components of that filament structure, two other things were identified. One is the presence of iron, significant, actually would appear to be significant relative amounts of iron, and in particular that iron appears to be in what's called a highly oxidized state. And that has serious implications in terms of health, most definitely, but I cut it off about 2/3 of the way down the list just to include those that would appear to be most likely, most probably identified here. I'll read that list very quickly. Right now that list is that of amines and carboxylic acids and aromatic substituted alkenes, aromatic substituted amines, alkanes, aldehydes, aromatic phenols, and alkyl halides. Now, we all understand that nobody's expected to understand what all these mean at this point. I can't say that I know everything. I have tried to educate myself as best I can in time and effort I put forth here. But we would understand that not everybody would know what these mean yet. But what we hopefully do understand is that these represent combinations of organic molecules that are at the core of biological existence. It has been learned over time that as complicated as we might be, as biological beings, that the chemistry, biochemistry of what takes place, that the focus of it is on these functional groups. That's why there is so much interest in them. Most of the reactions that take place from a biochemical point of view are taking place within what are called functional groups. There's no set finite number of how many there are. If you go to look for a table of them, you'll find one looked at a list, say, call it a dozen of them, saying these are the primary functional groups. You'll find another book with a more detailed listing that might have 24, this type of thing. But either way, what they're doing is reducing the potential combinations that can occur down to a manageable number, call it a dozen to 24, that are known to have significance in terms of biochemical reactions. So if you want to call it 24 or something like that, you're seeing that I'm listing roughly 8. That the 8 of that set have been identified by my work as being what I call target groups. I'll always use the word candidate or target or potential just because it's the way life is until you have a supportive or corroborating work and this type of thing. Wanted to thank you for being here again tonight. We've got close to a half a dozen folks again on the line from the staff of the Carnicom Institute. And tonight we're going to have the second part of what is intended to be a 3-part series covering in a media format a paper that is in development. The paper is fairly far along at this point, but it remains in progress. This paper is entitled Morgellons, a Working Hypothesis, with a subtitle of Neurothyroid Liver Oxygen Protein and Iron Disruption. And the paper will have 3 parts to it. This is being recorded on a screen share also, so hopefully tonight you will be able to see certain parts of the paper as I wade through it. The paper has 3 parts to it, and the first part, and I won't repeat everything that was covered in the first webinar on this. I may cover some of it in a very quick summary form, but not to the level of detail at all. Paper has 3 parts. The first is that the first part of the paper will cover the identification of certain functional groups. We talked about functional groups last time and their significance and what they mean, and how we acquire them with a certain instrument, namely called an infrared spectrophotometer, that the Institute has owned for about the past 6 months now. I guess it's a used one. It's fairly old, made in 1983, but is at least quite serviceable. There is a lot of modernization that can take place with that type of instrumentation, but we do have a functioning instrument that's giving us very important information coming in. So the first part of the paper covers the use and identification, use of the instrument and identification of these functional groups, which are organic combinations of molecules. It's for living things. This whole project is about something that would be organic, something that would be alive. Kate brought up the question last time about what are we doing with respect to basically metals and what would be inorganic substances, and I told her essentially that doesn't apply with this technology. This technology is directed solely to the existence of organic materials, those of living things, namely involving carbon and hydrogen-based compounds. The second part of the paper is going to cover the potential health impacts that would occur, or likely occur, might occur, could occur, or will occur from the existence of these particular functional groups. within a living being. And it would be faulty to think that because you have a functional group, that a functional group is somehow sort of expressive of a disease condition. Functional groups comprise all of organic chemistry, that which is healthy and successful as well as that which might be disease. So there's nothing to throw this off in one direction and to assume that just because it exists that somehow it has a negative connotation. That's not necessarily true. It depends in what form it exists, and we'll try to look at some of those possibilities. And then the third part of the paper is to present what will be called potential mitigating strategies that are based solely from a research point of view. I'm not a medical doctor. That's very clearly stated on any of the papers. I never assume that role in any fashion whatsoever. In fact, far from it. What I do is act as a researcher and provide information, and that will be done also from the standpoint of what might be potential mitigating factors. We have finished the first section, that regarding identification, last session, the last first webinar, and tonight we're covering the second part on the health impacts of these functional groups. So I just won't take the time to repeat all that we went through, other than if somebody has a question that you think would be beneficial to make sure we didn't miss anything, please don't hesitate